to you today with feelings of profound sorrow.
Picture this. Behind the heavy oak doors of Windsor Castle, a kingdom holds its breath while the ultimate royal showdown reaches its absolute boiling point. Charles thought he had survived every scandal, every public betrayal, and every media storm the modern world could possibly throw at him. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared him for the devastating moment. Princess stepped into the room, slid a confidential file across the mahogany table directly in front of Prince William, and exposed a secret master plan so explosive it threatened to tear the monarchy completely apart at the seams. Was this a desperate bid for family reconciliation, or was it a calculated Trojan horse designed to smash open the gates of Buckingham Palace on entirely their own terms? How does a grieving father choose between the agonizing guilt of pushing his own flesh and blood away forever, and the ironclad survival of an institution that has stood for 1,000 years? Before we dive deep into the shocking details that the palace desperately tried to sweep under the rug, take a second right now to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because what you are about to hear is a story the mainstream media refuses to touch. Charles looked down at those damning papers, his hands trembling as the harsh reality set in, and didn't soften a single word. She laid out the hidden clauses, the secret demands for elite security, and the backdoor paths back into high-profile ceremonial events without a single ounce of royal accountability. William saw the danger instantly, recognizing that his father's bleeding heart was being weaponized against the very crown he swore to protect. The silence in that room wasn't just heavy, it was deafening. And as the king stared into the abyss of his worst nightmare, the trap had already snapped shut. Let's uncover the explosive truth behind the headlines they never wanted you to see. The heavy silence inside that private Windsor room felt less like a pause in conversation, and more like the seconds ticking down before a detonator went off. Charles sat motionless at the center of the mahogany table, his eyes still locked onto the damning paragraphs of the confidential document and had just dropped in front of William. For months, the king had convinced himself that the bitter chasm separating him from Harry and his grandchildren was something time and patience might eventually heal. He had swallowed the endless stream of tabloid drama, weathered the explosive interviews, and endured the relentless public scrutiny, while clinging to the fragile hope of a quiet family reunion. But looking at the papers now, he realized that what he had hoped was a bridge back to his son was actually being framed as a strategic backdoor assault on the entire architecture of the crown, and did not give him time to retreat into his familiar comforting illusions. She pointed a steady finger directly at the clause outlining controlled appearances, demanding that everyone in that room acknowledge what those words actually meant in practice. A formal royal role was never just about standing on a balcony or waving to a crowd from a carriage. It carried the crushing weight of public responsibility, constitutional accountability, and strict adherence to the rules that govern the working members of the institution. Yet the proposal before them bypassed every single one of those constraints, asking for the elite visibility, the high security positioning, and the prestige of royal association without accepting a single ounce of the duty required to sustain it. William leaned forward, his expression hardening as he scanned the exact same passages that had left his father staring blankly into space. The prince knew immediately that this was not about forgiveness or late-night phone calls between a father and an estranged son. This was a blueprint for institutional chaos. He understood better than anyone that his father's deepest vulnerability was not politics, popularity, or public opinion. It was pure, unfiltered family guilt. Charles had spent years agonizing over whether his absence as a father during Harry's turbulent upbringing had somehow contributed to the explosive fracture that ultimately tore the family apart. That lingering guilt made him a sitting duck for anyone who knew how to push the right emotional buttons. And right now, those papers were pressing down on every raw nerve the king possessed. And knew it too, but she refused to let sentimentality blind her to the dangerous precedent being set. She reminded Charles that if they granted even a fraction of these unearned privileges under the banner of family mercy, it would establish an instant operational template that could never be undone. Every future event, every royal gathering, and every public appearance would become a battlefield of negotiation where the rules could be bent depending on who shouted the loudest or leaked the narrative to the press. Charles slowly reached up, removed his reading glasses, and set them down beside the dossier. His hand was visibly shaking, not from anger, but from the exhausting realization that every choice in front of him carried a devastating cost. If he said no and slammed the door shut on Meghan's proposal, he risked cutting off the tiny, fragile thread of contact linking him to his grandchildren, children whose faces he barely knew and whose laughter he desperately longed to hear in the corridors of the palace. But if he said yes, he was signing away the stability of the monarchy he had sworn to protect, handing over a loaded weapon to people who had already proven they knew how to use public sentiment against the crown. The room seemed to shrink around him as the magnitude of the moment settled deep into his bones. William watched his father struggle, recognizing that the king was fighting a war on two entirely different fronts. On one side stood the aching heart of a grandfather desperate to mend what time had broken, and on the other side stood the unyielding survival of an ancient institution that could not afford a single moment of structural weakness. The prince knew he had to step in before his father's emotional exhaustion made a decision that would outlast them all. But before William could deliver his warning, and revealed that this document was merely the final chapter of a much longer, carefully orchestrated campaign. Months earlier, long before this sweeping proposal ever crossed the king's desk, a smaller, seemingly harmless request had slipped quietly through the channels of palace communication. At the time, aides had dismissed it as a minor logistical inquiry concerning family seating at an upcoming Windsor gathering. Charles had welcomed that tiny spark of contact, viewing it as a harmless olive branch that might soften the freezing temperature between the households. But Anne had looked closer. She had analyzed the precise wording, noting how the request casually bypassed the normal bureaucratic gatekeepers and demanded special positioning alongside senior royals without any accompanying accountability. Back then, Charles had accused his sister of overreacting, arguing that a little administrative flexibility was a small price to pay for peace. Now, with the new proposal sitting right beside that old piece of correspondence, the terrifying pattern snapped into sharp focus. It had never been about a simple family get-together. It had been a tactical probing mission, a way to test how far the palace walls could be stretched before the masonry cracked, and laid the two documents side by side on the table, letting the silent evidence speak for itself. The earlier Windsor demand was the test run, and this new proposal was the full-scale invasion. William looked down at the paired papers, and every lingering doubt vanished from his mind. He saw the trap clearly now. If they conceded an inch to this new arrangement, they were validating every single maneuver that came before it, opening the floodgates to a permanent state of dual monarchy where influence could be wielded from across the ocean without a shred of institutional loyalty. Charles tried weakly to argue that refusing everything outright might permanently slam the door on reconciliation, his voice thick with the unmistakable pain of a father at the end of his rope. But Anne cut through the defense with surgical precision, telling him plainly that his personal guilt was being weaponized to force concessions he would never dream of granting to anyone else. The king looked away, pressing his palms against his eyes as the heavy silence closed back in, leaving him utterly defenseless against the harsh reality of the crisis unfolding around him. The weight of that silence pressed down on the mahogany table like a physical mass, suffocating every lingering shred of hope Charles had desperately clung to for months. William watched his father's shoulders sink, knowing that the king was trapped in an impossible purgatory between his public duty as a sovereign and the raw, gnawing ache of an estranged grandfather. But the prince also knew that sympathy could not be allowed to rewrite the operational rules of the British crown. He straightened up, his eyes fixed on the dossier that lay between them, and began to dismantle the illusion that a half-in, half-out arrangement could ever lead to true peace. William told his father in no uncertain terms that reconciliation could never be bought by handing out semi-official titles like party favors to people who had spent years tearing down the very institution they now wanted to casually drift back into. The prince explained that creating a structure where one royal center operated transparently inside the palace while another ran wild abroad, gathering attention, wielding influence, and weaponizing media sympathy without any of the constitutional restraints, was a recipe for absolute disaster. It would create two competing versions of royal life, confusing the public, paralyzing the courtiers, and injecting a permanent toxin into the heart of the monarchy's daily operations. Two centers of power under one banner could never peacefully coexist, especially when one side demanded all the glittering privileges of royalty, while treating accountability as an optional accessory. Anne nodded slowly in grim agreement, her expression hardening as she reinforced William's warning with evidence pulled straight from the dark archives of recent palace correspondence. She reminded the room that this wasn't some hypothetical fear born of paranoia. But Anne's sharp eyes had caught the hidden poison buried deep within the phrasing. The request didn't just ask for a seat in the pews. It demanded specific positioning, exemption from standard protocol, and direct communication channels that bypassed the traditional palace gatekeepers entirely. Back then, Charles had waved it away as harmless sentimentality, accusing his sister of seeing ghosts where there were only olive branches. But Anne had saved that correspondence, locking it away in her private files because she knew wolves rarely arrive in cages. They usually show up wrapped in the soft fleece of family reconciliation. Now, looking at the massive sweeping proposal sitting right beside that old Windsor note, the sinister blueprint was laid bare for everyone to see. The first request had been nothing more than a reconnaissance mission, a quiet test shot fired across the palace bow to see how much institutional masonry would crumble under emotional pressure. And because the palace hadn't slammed the door shut immediately, the strategy had escalated into a full-scale assault designed to cement a permanent foothold inside the royal family's inner sanctum without ever having to sign away their independence or answer to the British public. Charles tried to speak, his voice catching in his throat as he attempted to defend his desire to keep the family lines open, but the words felt hollow even to him. He whispered that completely slamming the door might mean never getting to watch his grandchildren grow up, never hearing their voices in the halls of his homes, and bearing the unbearable burden of knowing he chose a crown over his own flesh and blood. The raw vulnerability in the king's voice hung heavily in the air, pulling at every heartstring in that room. For a terrifying second, it seemed like the king's guilt might completely override his better judgment, threatening to hand the keys of the kingdom over to a strategy engineered to exploit his very weaknesses. But Anne refused to let emotion hijack the future of the nation, leaning forward to deliver a blow that stripped away every remaining illusion. She told Charles bluntly that his personal pain was no longer just a private family matter. It was becoming a dangerous geopolitical liability that would outlast his reign and land squarely on William's shoulders. She pressed him to answer whether he was truly prepared to grant a permanent exception that would allow anyone to parachute into major royal ceremonies whenever it suited their brand, while dodging every single tedious, exhausting, and unglamorous duty required of actual working royals. William backed her up with the chilling precision of a future king, who knew he would be the one force to clean up the mess. Through separate intelligence feeds and confidential briefings passed to him by senior aides, the prince had learned that the demands didn't stop at ceremonial seating. Whispers from across the Atlantic indicated that any future reconciliation was explicitly conditioned on high-profile public acknowledgement of Meghan's central role within the wider family network, effectively washing away years of attacks and institutional defiance with a single royal wave. The prince laid out the grim reality. If they allowed someone to bask in the blinding glow of royal visibility without being bound by royal accountability, they were essentially building a Trojan horse inside their own gates. It would send a devastating signal to every single working royal who spent their entire lives slogging through endless ribbon cuttings, charity hospital visits, and relentless public scrutiny, while receiving none of the sympathy and all of the blame. If an exiled couple could waltz back into high-profile ceremonies on their own terms, skipping the boring bits and cashing in on the prestige, then the entire concept of public duty became a joke. Charles slowly turned his head away from the table, staring out the tall palace windows toward the grey London sky as if searching for an answer written in the clouds. His face was etched with a profound, exhausting grief, the look of a man who realized that being a monarch meant sacrificing the very things that made life worth living. He looked back at William, his eyes deadened by the painful realization that his son wasn't just protecting an institution. He was protecting him from his own desperate, bleeding heart. The room fell into an absolute, suffocating hush, the kind of silence that precedes a tectonic shift in history, as the king prepared to make a choice that would echo through the history books long after they were all gone. The silence that followed was heavier than anything that had come before it, stretching across the mahogany table until it felt like a physical weight pressing down on every single person in the room. Charles slowly turned back from the window, his movements sluggish and weighed down by the crushing realization that his paternal instincts were actively dismantling the very shield protecting his crown. He looked from Anne, whose face remained carved from absolute stone, to William, who stood resolute with the unyielding posture of a future king guarding the gates of history. The king knew the game was up. He could no longer hide behind the comforting illusion that a quiet family reunion could coexist with the unforgiving machinery of the state. With a trembling hand, Charles reached out and pushed the scandalous dossier away from him, signaling a silent surrender to the harsh reality his children had forced him to face. But making the decision inside the sterile safety of a closed-door meeting was entirely different from unleashing it upon a world hungry for royal blood and sensational headlines. Within hours of that fateful summit, the carefully guarded walls of Windsor began to spring leaks, and what was supposed to remain a confidential family strategy exploded across the global media landscape with the velocity of a wildfire. By sunrise, the tabloids were screaming with sensational headlines, dissecting every rumored clause, every leaked memo, and every dramatic confrontation between the monarch and his fiercely protective family. The public narrative instantly fractured into a chaotic war zone, with commentators screeching about cold-hearted institutional rigidity on one side and necessary boundary setting against manipulative overreach on the other. Charles watched the morning news coverage in absolute horror as television pundits reduced his deepest, most agonizing personal heartbreak into a cheap soap opera script, complete with scorecards declaring winners and losers in a war he never wanted to fight. They talked about Meghan's strategic play and Anne's ice-cold intervention as if it were a game of chess, completely ignoring the tears, the sleepless nights, and the devastating fear of a grandfather who simply wanted to hold his grandchildren before his time ran out. Disgusted by the shallow noise, the king reached out and clicked the television off, plunging the room back into a heavy, suffocating quiet. He sat motionless for several long minutes, staring at the blank screen while the bitter irony washed over him. The media could spin whatever salacious narrative they wanted, framing the palace's firm boundary as a cruel punishment or an act of war, but they had no idea what it actually cost a father to sign away his own emotional peace for the sake of a crown. Across the Atlantic, the reaction was swift, volatile, and precisely the kind of explosive fallout Anne had predicted from the very beginning. When the formal palace response finally reached the Sussex household, a carefully worded document drawing a razor-sharp line between private family contact and official royal duties, the backlash was instantaneous. According to leaked reports from close confidants, Meghan viewed the response as a direct insult, an unacceptable half-measure that offered private crumbs while slamming the door in the face of the grand public recognition she felt she was rightfully owed. Harry found himself caught squarely in the middle of the shrapnel, torn between loyalty to his wife's uncompromising demands and the undeniable reality that his father had at least left a tiny, flickering candle burning for private reconciliation. But that tiny candle was immediately smothered by a second, even more aggressive wave of correspondence arriving from across the ocean, demanding to know precisely how the grandchildren would be treated compared to working royals at future landmark events. The question was a masterclass in psychological warfare, engineered to strike directly at King Charles's most vulnerable weak spot. It forced the king right back to the edge of the emotional precipice, whispering the terrifying possibility that loving his grandchildren might require him to surrender the institutional dignity of the entire monarchy. Yet this time the dynamic in the room was entirely different. Anne and William did not let him drown in his own guilt. They stood shoulder to shoulder, forming an unshakable human bulwark against the emotional siege. William stepped forward, his voice remarkably calm but laced with an absolute, terrifying finality that left no room for debate. He told his father that if they cased in now, if they allowed the grandchildren's access to be weaponized into a backdoor negotiation for public titles and ceremonial prestige, they wouldn't just be losing a battle, they would be surrendering the entire war. The prince laid down the ultimate boundary, declaring once and for all that while personal love knows no bounds, institutional status demands absolute accountability, strict rules, and unwavering loyalty to the crown. There could be no hybrid royals, no part-time sovereign representatives floating in and out of the spotlight whenever it suited their brand, and no special exceptions carved out by emotional blackmail. Charles listened to his son, and for the very first time since the crisis began, the bitter pill didn't taste like poison, tasted like protection. The king finally understood the brilliant, brutal necessity of Anne's initial confrontation. She hadn't attacked him out of malice or cold indifference. She had intervened to save him from himself, to stop his bleeding heart from engraving a permanent, fatal flaw into the foundation of the British monarchy. Slowly, deliberately, Charles reached across the table and placed his hand firmly over William's, A powerful, unspoken passing of the torch from a weary sovereign to the lion who would inherit his pride. The message was sent, the lines were drawn in blood and steel, and the great royal showdown finally reached its definitive conclusion. The Sussexes were met with an unyielding wall, the palace stood united against the tide, and the crown survived its most dangerous internal threat yet, proving once and for all that while a king can bleed for his family, he can never sacrifice his throne. The ink is dry, the final boundary lines have been etched in absolute stone, and the gates of Windsor Castle have slammed shut against a storm that nearly brought a 1,000-year-old dynasty to its knees. But as the dust settles over the palace grounds, one terrifying question remains hanging in the freezing London air. Was this ironclad defense the ultimate salvation of the British crown, or has it ignited a slow-burning fuse that will detonate the moment William finally takes the throne? Think about it. Can a royal family truly survive in the modern world when its deepest, most agonizing personal bloodlines are permanently severed by constitutional barbed wire? Or has the ultimate trap just been sprung on everyone involved? Drop your raw, unfiltered thoughts in the comments section below right now, because we want to hear every single word of what you really think about this seismic royal earthquake. Do you stand with Anne and William's ruthless institutional survival tactics, or does Charles's heartbreaking sacrifice prove that family will always matter more than a crown? Smash that like button, subscribe to the channel immediately, and ring the notification bell right this second, so you never miss a single second of the brutal, unfiltered truths the mainstream media is too terrified